My visit uncovered a child chained in my son's house, exposing a stepmother's abuse, lies, and a crime that sent her to prison. Margaret Collins stood in the kitchen of her small house in the Seattle suburbs, brewing her morning coffee while gazing at a photograph of her granddaughter, Emma, on the table. 6-year-old Emma's smile bore a striking resemblance to her late husband John's gentle eyes. It had been 5 years since Margaret's husband, John, had suddenly passed away from a heart attack. After 40 years as a nurse at the local hospital, Margaret was living a quiet retirement. David, who worked as a systems engineer at a major IT company, was hardworking and responsible, Margaret's pride and joy as a son. David had divorced his first wife 7 years ago, and had been raising Emma on his own ever since. Margaret understood her son's struggles and had provided as much support as possible. Visiting her granddaughter once a month was her greatest joy. Emma was friendly and would jump with excitement whenever Grandma came to visit. The time they spent together baking cookies, reading picture books, and playing in the park were Margaret's happiest moments. However, she had recently noticed that contact from her son was becoming less frequent. While they used to talk on the phone 2 or 3 times a week, now it was only a few times a month. Though she understood he was busy with work, her maternal instinct sensed something had changed. 3 months ago, David had reported that he had found a new partner. Her name was Linda, a single mother with an 8-year-old daughter. Margaret welcomed her son's new girlfriend, wishing for his happiness. She thought it would be good for her son, who had been raising Emma alone for so long, to have an understanding partner. However, since then, opportunities to see her granddaughter had drastically decreased. David explained that time was needed to adjust to the new environment and that he wanted to carefully build the relationship between Linda's daughter and Emma. Margaret respected her son's judgment and decided to keep her distance for a while, but even after 3 months, the situation hadn't changed. Even phone calls with Emma were difficult, and she couldn't remember the last time she had heard her granddaughter's voice. When she contacted her son, he always responded with, "I'm busy," or "maybe next time." She couldn't arrange any concrete meeting plans. Margaret gazed out the window and wondered. Perhaps the new partner found her presence bothersome. Maybe for her son, who was considering remarriage, a frequently visiting mother was an unwelcome presence. Such thoughts crossed her mind. What kind of life was Emma living now? Was she getting along well with her new mother? Perhaps she had forgotten about Grandma. Such anxieties were growing in her heart. Having worked as a nurse for many years, Margaret was skilled at reading subtle changes in people's expressions and words. There was clearly something different about her son's recent behavior. His tone was rigid, and she got the impression he was always in a hurry. It felt as though he was running from something or hiding something. On a weekend afternoon, Margaret made up her mind. She hadn't seen her granddaughter for 3 months, no matter how busy her son was or how much time was needed to build relationships with the new family. She had the right as a grandmother to check on her granddaughter's well-being. Margaret confirmed her son's address. It was a house he had purchased 2 years ago in a good location close to Emma's elementary school. She decided to make a surprise visit the next day. Imagining her granddaughter's delighted face, Margaret felt her heart leap with joy for the first time in a while. The next afternoon, Margaret headed to her son's house. In her hands, she carried a paper bag containing homemade cookies and a small stuffed animal for her granddaughter. Seattle's autumn sky was covered with clouds, and a chilly wind brushed against her cheeks. The residential area where her son lived was quiet, with colorful fallen leaves scattered across the front yards. When she arrived at David's house, Margaret paused for a moment. Something was different. The front yard, which had always been well maintained, looked neglected. The lawn had grown wild, and the flowers in the garden bed were withering. Newspapers and advertisements were overflowing from the mailbox. Fallen leaves had accumulated on the front steps, and it appeared no one had been cleaning. Margaret took a deep breath and pressed the doorbell at the entrance. She expected to hear Emma's footsteps running down the hallway as usual, but the house was enveloped in silence. She rang the bell again, but there was still no response. Looking around the driveway, she couldn't see her son's car. He might be at work. However, Linda and the children should have been home. Margaret approached a window to peek inside. The living room curtains were half closed, but she could see into the room through the gap. The sight she witnessed made her frown. Her son's house, which had always been neat and organized, was messy. Cushions were carelessly thrown on the sofa, and dishes and empty plastic bottles were left on the coffee table. Toys were scattered on the floor, but they weren't Emma's. Emma had a meticulous personality, and always cleaned up after playing. Margaret had taught her that. However, the toys now scattered about looked as if they had been thrown around carelessly. Margaret decided to walk around the house. When she approached the back door, she was surprised. The door was slightly open. Not only was it unlocked, but it was completely open. Her son was a cautious person who always locked all doors when going out. Margaret hesitated. It might not be appropriate to enter her son's house without permission. However, she was worried about her granddaughter's safety. She called out from the back door, "David, Emma, it's Grandma. Is anyone there?" There was no reply. However, she could hear faint sounds coming from inside the house. It wasn't the sound of a television. It sounded like something being dragged across the floor. Margaret steeled herself and stepped into the house. The kitchen looked completely different from before. Dishes were piled high in the sink, and half-eaten meals were left on the counter. Pictures drawn by children were attached to the refrigerator, but they weren't Emma's drawings. The number of people depicted was different. When she entered the living room, the messy state was even more pronounced. Food crumbs could be seen under the sofa, and there were stains on the carpet where something had been spilled. Several large cardboard boxes were stacked against the wall. It looked as if someone was preparing to move. Margaret looked toward the stairs. Faint sounds were coming from upstairs, not footsteps. Sounds of something being dragged and occasional small noises continued intermittently. Perhaps Emma was playing upstairs. "Emma, it's Grandma," Margaret called from the bottom of the stairs. However, there was no reply. The sounds continued, but she couldn't hear a child's playful voice. Anxiety was growing in her chest. Margaret stepped onto the stairs. The old wooden stairs creaked under her weight. Climbing carefully step by step, she observed the upstairs. The hallway was dim, and several room doors were closed. The sounds seemed to be coming from a room at the back. When she had visited this house before, Emma's room had been at the front of the hallway. Alphabet stickers were attached to the wall, and a handmade nameplate hung on the door. However, looking at that door now, the nameplate was gone. Margaret placed her hand on Emma's room door. After knocking, she gently opened the door. The room was empty. Emma's bed, toy chest, study desk, everything had been removed. All the photos and decorations that had been on the walls were also taken away, as if no one had ever lived there. Margaret's heart pounded violently. Where was Emma? Why was the room empty? What on earth was her son doing? The sounds came from the back room again. This time she heard them clearly. The sound of something being dragged across the floor and faint sobbing. Margaret proceeded to the back of the hallway. The room where the sounds were coming from had previously been used as her son's study. She could see that a new lock had been installed on the door. However, the lock was the type that could be locked from the outside, not from the inside. With trembling hands, she turned the doorknob. To her surprise, the door opened. It wasn't locked. The moment Margaret opened the door, a foul odor assaulted her, the smell of sweat and dirt and the stagnant air characteristic of a room that hadn't been ventilated for days. The room was dim, with curtains tightly closed. In the corner of the room, Margaret witnessed an unbelievable sight. A small figure was sitting against the wall. When she approached, it was clearly a child. However, the sight of this child left Margaret speechless. She could see something glinting on the wrist, a metallic gleam. When she realized it was handcuffs, Margaret's knees began to shake. The child's body was dirty, and the clothes looked as if they hadn't been changed for days. On the exposed arms and legs, she could see several blue bruises. Most shocking of all were the child's eyes. They were vacant, lifeless. Eyes filled with fear and despair were staring at Margaret. Margaret stood frozen at the entrance to the room. Could this be real? She couldn't believe she was witnessing such a scene in her son's house. However, the reality before her eyes could not be denied. The child shrank back slightly while trembling, turning her face away from Margaret. From that reaction, it was painfully clear that this child had been living in fear for a long time. In the dim room, the child's figure slowly became clearer. It was a girl about 6 to 8 years old. However, it wasn't Emma. The hair color was different, as was her build. The girl was sitting with her back against the wall, her knees drawn to her chest. Handcuffs were indeed on her wrists, with the other end connected to a pipe near the wall. The moment she saw this sight, Margaret's blood ran cold. The girl's clothes were dirty and torn, clearly having not been changed for days. On her exposed arms were several blue-purple bruises, both old and new, mixed together. Her face was gaunt, her cheeks hollow. Signs of malnutrition were evident. What pained her most were the child's eyes. They had lost their vitality, were vacant, as if her soul had been drained away. They were eyes that feared and had completely lost trust in humans. Even when Margaret entered the room, the girl wouldn't look up. Margaret slowly stepped into the room. The floor was dirty, and plastic containers were placed in the corner, probably for meals and waste. The room had a window, but it was completely covered with thick curtains, letting in no outside light. The air was stagnant, clearly having not been ventilated for a long time. "It's okay. Don't be afraid," Margaret spoke in the gentlest voice possible. "I'm Grandma. I won't hurt you." The girl shrank back slightly. She responded to Margaret's voice but wouldn't look up. From that reaction, it was painfully clear that she had likely been subjected to violence from adults for a long time. Margaret approached carefully. From her experience as a nurse, she knew how to approach patients with trauma. Sudden movements or loud voices would only cause more fear. She knelt down at a distance from the girl. "What's your name?" Margaret asked in a whisper-like voice. The girl answered in a small, trembling voice. "Sophia." "Sophia? That's a lovely name." Margaret smiled at her. "I'm Margaret. How long have you been here?" Sophia shook her head. She might have lost track of time. This room had no clock or calendar, and with the window covered by curtains, she couldn't see outside. She had been placed in an environment where she couldn't distinguish between day and night. The handcuffs were metal and solidly made. They couldn't be removed without a key. Sophia's wrists were chafed and red, showing she had been restrained for a long period. "Who put you here?" Margaret asked, but Sophia didn't answer. She just shrank back even smaller. Margaret's heart was filled with anger and sadness. How much suffering had this little girl endured? Was she being fed properly? Was she receiving medical care? And why was this happening in her son's house? With trembling hands, she took out her cell phone. First, she had to contact her son to clarify the situation. Perhaps someone was using this house without David's knowledge, or perhaps there was some mistake. Margaret said to Sophia, "Wait just a moment. I'll help you right away." Sophia nodded slightly. In that gesture, she felt she saw a glimmer of hope. Margaret stood up, left the room, and dialed her son's number. The few seconds until the call connected felt like an eternity. Her heart was pounding violently, and her hands were shaking. "Hello, this is David." Her son's voice came through. As usual, he sounded busy. "David, it's me." Margaret's voice was trembling. "I'm at your house right now." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the phone. "Mom, why are you at the house? How did you get the key?" The back door was open. "David, something terrible is happening. There's a little girl upstairs and she's handcuffed, a child named Sophia." Another silence followed. Margaret waited for her son's reaction. Surely he would be surprised and he would explain immediately. There must be some misunderstanding about this situation. However, David's response was completely different from what Margaret had expected. "Mom, what are you talking about? I don't live there anymore. I moved 3 weeks ago. Who are you talking about?" Margaret was at a loss for words. Her son's voice seemed confused, but at the same time it sounded strangely too calm. "But this is your house. I'm definitely at your address. And there's a little girl here who's being held captive. Mom, calm down. I really don't live there anymore. I moved to a new apartment with Linda. Maybe you have the wrong address." Margaret was confused. However, she was definitely at her son's house. The mailbox had her son's name on it, and the interior was as she remembered. "Where is Emma?" "I want to see my granddaughter," Margaret asked. David's voice became even colder. "Emma is with her mother. Due to custody issues, I can't see her for a while." "Mom, are you really okay? Aren't you confused about something?" Margaret was stunned. Was her son lying? or did he really not know anything? However, the reality before her eyes could not be denied. Sophia was definitely here and needed help. "David, I'm not lying. There really is a girl here. She's handcuffed and in terrible condition. Come here immediately." "Mom, I'm at work and can't come right away. If there's really a problem, you should call the police, but I don't live there anymore and I don't know anything about it." The call ended. Margaret stared at her smartphone and stood still. Her son's reaction was abnormal. Normally, if a mother called with such news, he would rush over immediately. However, David spoke as if it were someone else's business. Margaret returned to the room. Sophia continued sitting in the same position. Looking at her, Margaret's heart was made up. Whatever her son said, she had to help this child in front of her. "Sophia, it's okay. I'll definitely help you," Margaret promised. But what should she do? Should she call the police? But considering the possibility that her son was involved, she hesitated. First, she needed to know the truth about the situation. Margaret made a decision. Tonight, she would watch what happened in this house. She had to find out who was taking care of Sophia and who had created this terrible situation. She gave Sophia water and cookies, trying to make her a little more comfortable. Then she waited for night to come. As dusk deepened, Margaret went outside the house. She had promised Sophia that she would definitely come back and had returned the room door to its original state. She couldn't remove the handcuffs, but at least she had placed a water bottle and the cookies she had brought within reach. Margaret hid in the shadow of a large oak tree across from the house. It was a perfect spot in the darkness beyond the streetlight's reach where she could watch her son's house. The autumn night was cold, and her thin cardigan wasn't warm enough, but she couldn't move. She couldn't leave this place until she knew the truth. Around 7 in the evening, a car stopped in front of the house. It was a blue sedan, a car she didn't recognize. A woman got out of the car. She had shoulder-length brown hair tied back and was wearing what looked like work clothes, a suit. She looked around wearily before heading to the back entrance of the house. Margaret held her breath and watched. She had no idea who this woman was or why she was entering her son's house. The woman opened the back door with a key in a practiced manner and went inside. Soon, lights came on in the upstairs window. About 30 minutes later, Margaret saw a figure in the light leaking through the window gap. The woman seemed to have entered the room where Sophia was. Margaret leaned forward from behind the tree, trying to observe the house as much as possible. After a while, she could hear the woman's voice. Perhaps because the window was slightly open, the voice carried outside in the night silence. "Sophia, you've been crying again. How many times do I have to tell you?" The woman's voice was cold, filled with irritation. Margaret shuddered. There wasn't a trace of affection in that voice. It was as if she were dealing with some troublesome object. "Here's today's portion. This should last 3 days," the woman's voice continued. "I'll leave water with it too, so drink it carefully. I don't know when I'll be able to come next." Margaret understood that the woman was giving Sophia minimal food and water. However, the frequency was once every 3 days. For a 6-year-old child, that was far too harsh treatment. The woman's voice could be heard again. This time, it seemed like she was talking to herself. "I told David that I'm homeschooling her, so no one suspects that she's not going to school. I explained to the neighbors that she has severe autism and can't make contact with people. Perfect excuse." Margaret's blood ran cold. The woman had been systematically lying to hide Sophia's existence, and this woman had some kind of relationship with her son, David. The woman's voice continued. "The regular checkup calls from Child Protective Services are only once a month. I just need to treat Sophia normally during those times. It's all acting. All acting." Margaret was appalled. This woman had even deceived Child Protective Services. Once a month, she treated Sophia like a normal child, and the rest of the time kept her in confinement. "But it'll all be over soon." The woman's voice carried a satisfied tone. "Once my marriage to David is decided, I'll send Sophia to an institution. With the reason that she can't adapt to the new environment, then there will be no bothersome presence in our new life." Margaret covered her mouth with her hand to suppress a scream. This woman was Linda, her son's new partner, and she was treating her own daughter, Sophia, as a nuisance, abusing her, and ultimately planning to get rid of her. David is too kind. He says things like, I want to give Sophia love too. But men give up when they know the reality. If I gradually exaggerate my reports of Sophia's problem behaviors, he'll eventually agree to send her to an institution. Margaret understood that her son was being deceived. David wasn't being told about Sophia's real situation. Linda had been giving her son false reports that Sophia was a problematic child. Well, just a little more patience. Linda's voice could be heard. David's mother called today, but I said he doesn't live here anymore, so it's fine. There won't be any suspicion. Margaret trembled. She understood her son's reaction during the phone call. David had really left this house and was living somewhere else with Linda. However, Linda was secretly continuing to use this house and confining Sophia, and she was lying to her son that Sophia was being properly cared for elsewhere. Footsteps could be heard from upstairs, and soon lights came on downstairs. Linda seemed to have come downstairs. Margaret leaned forward slightly from behind the tree to observe the inside of the house in more detail. From the living room window, she could see Linda. She was talking to someone on her cell phone. David, it's me, Linda. You got a strange call from your mother today, didn't you? Margaret realized that the content of her phone call with her son was being discussed. Yes, she's completely confused. It might be early symptoms of dementia. At her age, these things happen, so don't worry. Margaret's body shook with anger. Linda was lying to her son that his mother had dementia. She was leading her son to doubt his mother's testimony. Sophia? Sophia is fine. The new treatment program is showing results, and she's become much calmer, but the doctor says it's better to avoid contact with outsiders for now. Linda was also lying about Sophia. She was reporting to her son that his daughter was receiving treatment and improving while actually continuing to abuse her. When the call ended, Linda began walking around inside the house. She seemed to be looking for something. Eventually, she took out a large suitcase and began packing. This place has reached its limit too, Linda said to herself. David's mother has started snooping around. I need to move her to another place. Margaret was struck with terror. Linda was planning to move Sophia to another location. If that happened, it might become impossible to find Sophia. Linda went upstairs again. This time there were loud noises. She seemed to be carrying luggage, and she could hear her voice talking to Sophia. Tomorrow we're moving to another place, a quieter place, and soon you'll be going to an institution. Then both David and I will be free. Margaret couldn't stand it anymore. She couldn't let this situation continue. Sophia's life was in danger. With trembling hands, she took out her cell phone and dialed 911. 911. Which emergency service do you need? Police, please. It's child abuse in progress. Margaret spoke in as quiet a voice as possible. The address is... Margaret gave her son's house address and briefly explained the situation. The operator responded calmly and promised to dispatch a patrol car immediately. 15 minutes later, the sound of sirens could be heard from far away. Linda seemed to be panicking inside the house, and frantic movement could be heard, but it was too late. The patrol car arrived, and police officers surrounded the house. Margaret came out from behind the tree and called out to the officers. I'm the one who called. There's a child confined upstairs. That night, Linda was arrested for child abuse and unlawful confinement. Sophia was taken to the hospital by ambulance and received proper medical care. Margaret gave detailed testimony at the police station, revealing the full extent of the systematic abuse that had been going on for 3 years. The truth was more horrifying than imagined. However, Sophia was saved. That was the only salvation. 6 months had passed since then. Seattle Spring was decorated with cherry blossoms, and new life was sprouting in Margaret's small garden. She sat on the garden bench, rereading a letter. It was a progress report from Sophia's foster parents. The police investigation revealed the full extent of Linda's crimes. After her divorce from her ex-husband, she had gained custody of Sophia. But when her relationship with David began, she started treating her daughter as a nuisance. It began with emotional abuse and eventually escalated to physical violence. To advance her relationship with David, Linda continued to portray Sophia as a problem child. Using her son's kind nature, she repeatedly persuaded him that Sophia needs specialized care and an institution would be better for her. David had been deceived. Most shocking was the duration of the confinement. Sophia had been locked in that room for 3 years. She was given food once a day, sometimes only once every 2 days. She was only allowed to use the toilet at designated times, and even her minimum human dignity was stripped away. The deception of Child Protective Services was also systematic. During the monthly phone checks, Linda temporarily freed Sophia and acted out a normal parent-child relationship. Her performance was perfect, and the caseworker couldn't detect signs of abuse. At the trial, Margaret's testimony became decisive evidence. The recording she had made of Linda's soliloquy and the detailed medical report proved 3 years of abuse. Linda was charged with multiple crimes, including child abuse, unlawful confinement, and false reporting to Child Protective Services, and received a 15-year prison sentence. David was not directly involved in the abuse, but received a suspended sentence for negligence in not paying sufficient attention. Emma's custody was also temporarily restricted, and currently only supervised visits are permitted. Most importantly was Sophia's recovery. When first rescued, she suffered from severe malnutrition and post-traumatic stress disorder. However, with specialized treatment and the loving care of her foster family, she was gradually showing signs of recovery. The foster parents, the Johnsons, were an experienced couple with expertise in childcare. According to their letter, Sophia wouldn't speak to anyone for the first few months, but recently had begun to show smiles little by little. She had also started attending school and beginning to interact with children her own age. Sophia has come to love drawing, the letter said. Yesterday she drew a rainbow for the first time. It was a colorful and beautiful rainbow. We feel hopeful. Margaret wiped away her tears. The fact that Sophia had drawn a rainbow meant that color was beginning to return to her heart. Her relationship with Emma was also slowly being repaired. Until David's situation settled, Emma often spent weekends at Margaret's house. Her granddaughter initially couldn't understand what had happened to the family, but Margaret was gradually explaining the truth in age-appropriate words. "Grandma, is Sophia going to be okay?" Emma had asked last week. "Yes, she'll surely get better. It takes time, but with love and patience, people can always recover," Margaret answered. Through this experience, Margaret had come to think deeply about the meaning of family. Blood relations alone don't make a family. The feelings of protecting, loving, and wishing for a child's happiness are what create true family bonds. Margaret carefully folded the letter and put it away safely. Tomorrow, she was scheduled to do volunteer work with a local child protection organization. She was thinking about what she could do for children in need. Using this experience, a small bird perched on the cherry tree in the garden and sang a beautiful song. A new season was beginning for Sophia, for Emma, and for Margaret herself. This was the beginning of a new life. With love and courage, any difficulty could be overcome. Margaret believed this, and her belief was not wrong.